So between the years 1450 and 1750, Europeans were pushing their way into the Indian Ocean trade, but they were by no means the dominant player. Europeans were really just getting a foothold. Europeans couldn't have as big of an impact in Asia as they did in America because there were civilizations that were more technologically advanced, and at this time the big Asian powers were still more powerful than the big European powers. So these were the Mughals, Ming China, the Ottomans, and even Japan. So we talked about how initially there was this trade imbalance because Europeans didn't really have anything that the Chinese or other Asian powers wanted. This changed once Europeans got their hands on some of the valuable resources of the Americas, and this is especially true with silver. In the mid-1500s, the Spanish colonists found the world's richest silver mine in what is now Bolivia, and this increased the amount of silver that was available around the world. So, the Spanish had control of the richest area in America. They also controlled the Philippines, and they would haul silver overland from Bolivia to Mexico, and from Mexico they would ship it across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippines. And this was really the first time the Americas and Asia were linked in a sustained trading network. So, in terms of globalization, this is a major milestone because now it meant that for the first time there's a real global economic system. We have trade across the Atlantic with the Columbian Exchange, we have the Silk Road, we have the Trans-Saharan trade, the Indian Ocean trade. The world is being brought together. So let's just backtrack a bit and look at silver. Why was this metal so important? And basically, silver became so highly prized because China, which was the world's largest superpower, wanted lots of silver. In the 1570s, the Ming Dynasty really pushing for the growth of the Chinese economy, and they didn't want people living as subsistence farmers, growing their own food and trading in an exchange or barter economy. That wasn't going to make China richer. What the Ming Dynasty wanted to do was force people to convert to a money system, and to convert to a purely money-based economy, the Ming Dynasty decided that it was no longer acceptable for peasants to pay taxes through crops or through labor. Taxes had to be paid in silver. So, for a peasant farmer, the implications were huge. It meant that they had to sell crops to get silver, so more and more people moved away from farming just for themselves or farming and trading what they farmed, and towards the farming of cash crops to sell. And you have these regions in China being converted to specific crop-producing areas. So huge areas being converted to rice-producing areas, silk-producing areas, and so on. So silver was the preferred currency of China, and 85% of this silver came to China from the Spanish colonies in America. The Spanish silver coin was called a piece of 8, and this was the most popular form of currency in the world, so sort of like the early modern equivalent of the American dollar. So, in say the 1600s, you could be in America, China, India, West Africa, and you could pull out the silver coin, the Spanish piece of 8, and merchants would instantly know what it is. So this really illustrates a new globalization in the world. The story about silver shows that China is still very much the world's superpower. It was China's decision to switch to silver as a form of currency that led to the silver rush. This increased the amount of goods that were being exchanged, and it was really the first step to bringing the world economy together. Europeans were middlemen, basically taking silver from America and bringing it to China. But the silver trade also allowed Europe to become more prominent on the world stage, and possibly one of the factors that helped Europe become one of the world's superpowers following the early modern era. So continuing on the theme of globalization and new interactions between people, the early modern period brought people living in northern North America and Siberia into a larger world economy. And up until this point, these were people that were not really under the influence of the world's major civilizations. And these people would be integrated into the world economy, not through the trading of silver, but instead through the trading of fur. In Europe, China, and the Ottoman Empire, fur was considered to be a status symbol. Furs were in high demand in colder countries because, well, they were warm and they could increase the standard of living, so fairly simple. And at one point, Western Europe had lots of fur bearing animals, but a lot of these animals were overhunted, and others lost their homes when land was cleared for agriculture. By 1500, Western Europe's population of beaver and rabbits and marten, fur bearing animals, had basically been wiped out. In North America, the fur trade was highly competitive. The French set up shop along the St. Lawrence Valley in the Great Lakes region. British traders sailed north and into the Hudson Bay, and the Dutch focused on trading along the Hudson River in modern New York. Europeans didn't really participate in the trapping and hunting process of the fur trade. This was almost always done by indigenous people who traded the furs with Europeans for things like guns, blankets, metal tools, alcohol. So this was definitely a different type of relationship than the one that existed between indigenous people and the Spanish in the Spanish American colonies. This is not a directly coerced labor force. At first, some indigenous people benefited quite a bit from the fur trade. I think there's this misconception that Europeans traded worthless stuff to the indigenous people and ruthlessly exploited them for their furs, but this wasn't really the case. The indigenous people were intelligent people. They've been trading for thousands of years in very organized societies. They knew what they were doing, and because they were different European nations, they could demand a fair price for their furs. But what the indigenous fur traders couldn't have foreseen was the impact of European disease, and like in other parts of America, there was a massive population collapse. Europeans also had negative effects in other ways. Europeans brought firearms, and this increased the damage caused by warfare. There were wars fought between British and French, and alliances with British and French brought indigenous groups into the conflicts. Alcohol, which had previously been unknown to the indigenous people, became widespread and very destructive. While all of this was happening in northern North America, it was being paralleled in Siberia. The Russian Empire incorporated Siberia into their empire, and Siberia became the source of furs for Russia, China, and the Ottoman Empire. The fur trade in Siberia had a lot of the same negative impacts on Siberians as it did to indigenous North Americans. Siberians were geographically isolated and they were devastated by diseases, but unlike in North America, there was no competition in the fur trade. It was entirely in the hands of the Russian Empire, and in many ways, Siberians had it a lot worse. All adults were forced to pay taxes in the form of furs, and they were imprisoned and in some cases executed if they didn't produce enough furs for the Russian Empire.